God's chosen ones. You handled them like no one else. And that's why they can't forget you. You weren't unpredictable. You were unreadable because they were using the wrong language to study a divine design. They thought you were easy to play. They thought one push would make you beg. One insult would make you break. One twisted word would unlock your reactions like a trigger. But you didn't flinch. You didn't explain. And that silence, it wrecked them. Because when they sat across from you, smug, rehearsed, and ready to manipulate, they didn't realize they weren't sitting across from prey. They were sitting across from the mirror. And in your calm, they saw every crack they tried to hide. You didn't break their heart. You broke their script. And now, they replay conversations in their mind like a riddle they can't solve. You weren't the chapter they could turn the page on. You were the sentence they never got to finish. They didn't lose you. They lost to you. And that chosen one is why they're obsessed. If you've ever left someone spiraling just by staying whole, stay with me. There's something God wants you to hear. Drop 777 in the comments if this already feels like your story. You didn't walk into their life to fight. You walked in to love, to pour peace into chaos, to offer truth without demand, to sit still in a room full of ego. But what they saw wasn't a gift, it was a threat. They couldn't place you, couldn't label you, couldn't control you. So they tried to provoke you. They mocked your stillness, tried to bait your emotions, made you question your sanity. They turned rooms cold just to see if you'd shiver. But you didn't. Because you weren't there to play games. You were there as a divine disruption. And here's what they'll never say out loud. They're obsessed now, not because you hurt them, but because you handled them. Handled them with grace that burned more than revenge ever could. Handled them with a silence so heavy, it's still echoing in their spirit. Handled them with spiritual restraint that made them feel exposed, powerless. Smile. They came with chaos. You answered with calm. They yelled. You listened. They accused. You observed. They plotted. And you passed every trap like you already had the blueprint. Because you did what they didn't know was, God trained you in shadows long before they arrived. And when they met you, they weren't meeting confusion. They were meeting calculation. They still don't get it, still don't understand how you walked away intact, still think about what they missed, still spiral in the silence you left behind. Why? Because you weren't reacting, you were reflecting. You weren't unpredictable, you were spiritually encrypted. You weren't like the rest, you were chosen. If you're still watching this, it's not by accident. You're not just here for closure, you're here for confirmation. Drop 777 if you feel God already speaking between these words. Chapter 1. The day the game didn't work, you didn't raise your voice. You didn't swing back. You just watched as their playbook collapsed in real time. They came ready for war, but didn't realize the battlefield had changed. Because this time, their games didn't work. They tried it. The bait, the guilt trip, the passive-aggressive silence, the sudden praise after the disrespect, the I was just joking after the deep cut. They threw every move they'd used on others before. But when they met you, it was like casting shadows on someone who had already met the sun. They called your stillness arrogance. They called your discernment paranoia. They said you were too sensitive, too serious, too much. But you knew what was really happening. Because long before they rehearsed their manipulation, you had already lived through darker storms. Long before they disguised harm as humor, God had taught you how to feel energy before words ever came. They told themselves you were just another chapter. What they didn't realize was that you were the storm the book never recovered from. They thought they had you, but you didn't react. You didn't defend. You didn't even explain. You just went still. And in that silence, they lost control. Because the moment they couldn't trigger you, they realized they had no power left. You weren't frozen. You were calculating. You were waiting. You were measuring their patterns, tracking their inconsistencies, watching how they played with truth like it was plastic. And when the time came, you didn't confront them. You didn't explode. You just left. And that was the beginning of their obsession. Because they didn't just lose access. They lost control. They didn't just lose a person. They lost the illusion they were in charge. If someone's weapon is your reaction, what happens when you stop reacting? They had questions, dozens of them. Why didn't it work? Why didn't they fold? How did they see through me? But the real question was this: why do I still think about them when they're not thinking about me? Because chosen one, you didn't just break the cycle. You were the cycle breaker. Drop 7. If you've ever disarmed someone's entire manipulation with nothing but silence, that was the day the game didn't work, and they've never recovered since. Chapter 2. You weren't reacting, you were recording. They thought you were confused. But what they didn't see was the notepad in your spirit. The one where you were writing down every contradiction, every fake apology, every tone that didn't match the words. You weren't reacting. You were recording. While they were playing checkers with your heart, you were quietly drawing the blueprint to their game. They saw your silence and called it weakness, but heaven called it wisdom. Because chosen one, you weren't there to win the argument. You were there to win the war of awareness. You don't need to scream when you already know the ending. They thought they were in control, that they could gaslight you, twist timelines, deny what you felt. But you didn't need their permission to believe what you saw. You were already documenting the moment their soul lied. You didn't challenge it, you archived it. They mistook your restraint for uncertainty, but you weren't second-guessing. You were gathering receipts in spirit. You were letting the rope get longer because you already knew where it would lead. And when it tightened, it didn't trap you, it exposed them. Imagine a courtroom. You don't need to argue when you're the one holding the evidence. That's what your silence was. Exhibit A, their tone. Exhibit B, the pause after you spoke truth. Exhibit C, the smirk they wore when they thought they won. They didn't know you were built in quiet places, that God had taught you not just how to survive betrayal, but how to watch it unfold without flinching. They told themselves you were overthinking. You were actually over-remembering. Every time they shifted the blame, you took a mental note. Every time they forgot their own lie, you bookmarked it. Every time they tried to rewrite the past, you highlighted the truth they couldn't erase. You were the calm they couldn't rattle, and that terrified them. What kind of power is it to see someone's whole plan unfold and never say a word? They lost the moment you stopped trying to convince them, the moment you stopped explaining your value, the moment you went quiet and let them talk long enough to expose themselves. You didn't interrupt because you didn't need to. You weren't trying to prove anything. You were letting them build their own downfall brick by brick. And when they finally looked around for someone to blame, you were already gone. Drop 777. If you've ever watched someone bury themselves while blaming you for the shovel, you weren't defensive. You were divine strategy in motion. That wasn't retreat. That was record. And now, they replay it all in their head. But you already archived it and moved on. Chapter 3. The mirror they couldn't smash. You never called them out. You didn't list their lies. You didn't scream, accuse, or unravel the past in a rage. But when you walked in, everything false in them began to tremble. Because chosen one, you didn't show up to be seen. You showed up to reveal. They thought you were just another person, someone to charm, test, control, use. But what they didn't realize was that you were a mirror, and mirrors don't lie. A room full of smoke and cracked glass. Everyone pretending, performing, and then you walk in, silent, still, a presence that can't be explained. And suddenly the masks stop fitting. The scripts sound hollow. The lights don't hide the cracks anymore. Because your presence didn't just enter the room, it exposed the room. They smiled at you, but clenched their jaw when you didn't flinch. They praised you, but panicked when you didn't perform. They tested you, but you didn't react, and that shook them. Because you weren't reflecting their fantasy. You were reflecting their fear. You didn't raise your voice, but your energy raised the truth. They weren't triggered by anything you said. They were triggered by what your existence revealed. Their entire identity stitched together with ego, performance, and projection began to feel small next to your authenticity. They realized too late. You weren't trying to impress them. You were the impression. You didn't come in to compete. You weren't trying to win. You were just real. And for someone who's built their life on lies, real is unbearable. They started copying your tone, mocking your stillness, challenging your peace. Why? Because something in you told the truth about them. You weren't loud, but your stillness screamed. You could be free too if you stopped performing. Drop 700 success. If your presence ever made someone see themselves more clearly than they wanted to. Imagine standing in front of a shattered mirror. Each shard reflects a version of you until you step back and realize none of them are yours. None of them are real. They're all projections from people who couldn't hold their own reflection. That's what happened when they met you. You didn't judge them. You didn't expose their secrets. You just stayed grounded in truth. And the truth made their mask crack. What if your only role was to reflect what someone else was afraid to face? You were never attacking. You were aligning, never performing, just present. And now, your absence rings louder than any confrontation ever could, because they don't miss your words. They miss the chance to rewrite the script. But the script is done. The mirror is gone, and all that's left is their reflection. You weren't their mirror. You were the last one they couldn't smash, and that's what haunts them most. Chapter 4. The masterpiece they mistook for a draft. They looked at you and saw something to fix, to mold, to shrink, to tame. But what they never realized was that you weren't a draft. You were the final edition. They approached your soul like editors with red pens, critiquing your softness, labeling your depth as too much, trying to revise the very brushstrokes God himself designed. But you weren't waiting for approval. You weren't unfinished. You were already whole. Picture this. An art collector walks into a gallery. Before them hangs a one-of-a-kind piece. It's layered, textured, painted with tears and time. But they squint and say, "It's nice, but I'd change this part. It's too bold, too strange, too honest." They don't see the masterpiece. They see a mirror they don't understand. And instead of honoring it, they criticize what they're too small to comprehend. You gave them a secret thing. Your presence, your insight, your patience, and they mistook it for something that needed their shaping. But chosen one, you were not made to be molded by the unprepared. You were made to stand tall even when they tried to clip your wings. They couldn't hold your intensity, so they called you dramatic. They couldn't follow your wisdom, so they called you difficult. They couldn't match your loyalty, so they called you clingy, but none of it was truth. It was just projection, their inability to hold what was too real for their hands. They didn't mishandle you because you were flawed. They mishandled you because you were fire and they were foam. They thought they could leave and come back, keep you on the shelf while they explored lesser things. But they forgot. Masterpieces aren't kept in rotation. They're placed behind glass, preserved, protected, unreachable. Once lost. Drop 7 MVV7. If someone once treated you like a draft, not realizing you were already divine art, your soul was painted by storms, sculpted by silence, polished by pain. You didn't need edits. You needed honor. And instead of honoring you, they tried to downgrade your value just to feel taller beside you. But here's the truth. Their smallness was never your burden. Their blindness was never your fault. They skimmed the masterpiece, called it too much. And now they stand outside the gallery, pressed to the glass, wondering how they ever missed it. How many sacred souls are being rewritten by people who never learned how to read truth. You weren't a draft. You were the sacred design. And now that you're gone, they don't miss what they had. They mourn what they never deserved. Chapter 5. The disappearance that spoke louder than words. You didn't walk out to hurt them. You walked out to save yourself. And that became their punishment. You didn't slam the door. You didn't burn the bridge. You didn't write the long message or leave a final monologue. You just left. And in that stillness, they heard something they never expected. The sound of being cut off from what they never deserved. They were rehearsing for drama, expecting the explosion, bracing for the confrontation. But when you disappeared with no tears, no words, no warning, they weren't prepared. Because chosen one, you didn't exit like a victim. You vanished like a boundary. Sometimes the loudest goodbye is the one you never say out loud. They had a plan, a final act, a scene they could control. But you ruined the script. You ended the play before they could take their last bow. And now they sit on that stage, lights off, crowd gone, rehearsing lines you'll never hear. They didn't expect your silence to sting. They thought they could manipulate one more conversation, twist one more truth, earn one more reset. But instead, you gave them consequence, not rage, not revenge, just a locked door they'll never have the key to again. You didn't ghost them. You graduated from them. Imagine a stage performer waiting for applause, only to realize the audience left hours ago. That's how your silence hit. Not cruel, just final. They're not haunted by the loss. They're haunted by the lack of control. Because you didn't ask for understanding. You didn't need closure. You became the closure. Drop 777. If your silence ever became someone else's awakening, they replay it now, not the moments of connection, but the moment they realized they had no more access. And the echo is deafening. Because you didn't just leave, you refused to give them an ending they could rewrite. What happens when someone's final power over you is taken away by your peace? They draft messages you'll never see. Scroll your page hoping for a sign. But you're already gone. Not lose. Gone with intention. Because peace doesn't always say goodbye. Sometimes it just leaves the room and never returns. You didn't need a moment to explain your departure. You needed space to protect your destiny. And in the absence you left behind, they finally heard your truth. Loud, unapologetic, divine. You didn't just survive them. You silenced them. And not with rage, but with restraint, with peace, with power. They never got the closure they planned. But you got the healing they never expected. Because you didn't need to win the fight. You needed to protect your flame. And you did. You weren't reacting. You were discerning. You weren't distant. You were divine. You weren't the phase. You were the awakening. They thought you disappeared. But the truth is, you ascended. You elevated past their reach. You outgrew the chaos. You outlasted the performance. And that is what still haunts them. Not what you said, but what you didn't have to say. You were the calm they couldn't counterfeit, the mirror they couldn't smash, the masterpiece they mishandled, the closure they never controlled. You didn't walk away empty. You walked away with everything they tried to strip from you. Your peace, your clarity, your sacred worth. What if your silence was never the absence of power, but the sound of heaven reclaiming you. You weren't just chosen to endure, you were chosen to elevate. Not everyone was meant to go with you. That's not rejection, that's refinement. If your soul felt seen today, drop subtitles in the comments. This is your confirmation. If you've ever left someone spinning with nothing but your silence, share this with a soul who needs to remember their power. Like, come on, system bay, not for numbers, but because we're building something real here. A movement, a mirror, a mission to remind God's chosen ones who they are. You weren't the one who got away. You were the one they never had in the first place. You are chosen. You are covered. You are untouchable. And you were never the phase. You were the awakening.